Dr. Madhusree Mukerjee, welcome to the All Walks of Life podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on, ma'am.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for asking me.
So, ma'am, how have you been keeping yourself busy during the quarantine period? Because I know there are people who started pursuing different hobbies, reading different books. Is there something that's kept you busy?
I actually have a full-time job, which I do out of home right now. I'm a senior editor at Scientific American magazine. And amazingly, although it's based in New York, amazingly enough, we've been able to work just fine using, well, all these technologies. So I'm really busy. It's not like I have free time.
Right.
I do have a book project that I've been working on for 10 years, and I would ideally love to get the time to finish that. We'll see.
That's really interesting, ma'am. Because I've heard you speak at different platforms, and I find your journey really intriguing in that sense. Because I think you pursued physics in academia, and then moved on to, as you said, you're currently pursuing, I think, scientific journalism or something along those lines.
Right.
At Scientific
I'm an
American.
editor. Right.
Right. So just walk me through your journey, and because I would really want to dive deep into your books as well in this conversation, but if you could just walk me through your intellectual journey and what's inspired you to do the things you've been doing.
So I was born in India, in Bengal, actually on the Bengal-Bihar border, educated mostly in Calcutta, and I flew to the US for a PhD in physics. I wanted to be a physicist, kind of an Einstein or whatever. I dreamt big at the time. I got a PhD at the University of Chicago. Then I got a postdoc at Caltech. And after Caltech, where I was actually ended up in a nuclear lab, it was theoretical nuclear physics. It so happened that I didn't get another job, which was a big shock for me because I had always wanted to be a physicist. That was my first love. I ended up moving to New York. Luckily, I write well because as a child, I was reading very deeply. And I became an editor first at Physics Today magazine, and then I moved to Scientific American, but which I actually loved because that magazine covers a very large range of topics, and I found pretty much everything interesting. And I also realized that I was capable of handling a large range of topics. Eventually, I left the magazine when I got a Guggenheim Fellowship to write a book on the Aboriginal peoples of the Andaman Islands. That was in late 1990s. And that for me too was a real experience because I had always sort of approached the world as a scientist. And when you're a scientist, you tend to assume that a lot of things about the social world, you think that you know how it works more or less. And during the researches for this book, during my transition to a journalist, which actually already started happening while I was at Scientific American, I realized there's a lot of difference between the way we are told things happen and the way things actually happen. And that's what I saw on the Andamans. I was initially curious about these people who I was told were savages who would behead these freedom fighters when they escaped from cellular jail. And once I was on the islands, I'm really understanding who these people were, these indigenous inhabitants. The story was so compelling and so tragic, really. And that became my first book, which was called, somewhat unfortunately, The Land of Naked People. I didn't mean to draw attention to the nakedness of the Andamanese. What I had realized by the time I finished that book was that that island is a setting for such naked ambition and greed and corruption. It's very beautiful, but it was really shocking to me in the end. By the time I understood how things really work, That's what I meant by the land of naked people, although anyway.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, continue.
Yeah, so that's really interesting to hear, and I really want to get into that in a bit. But just starting off with your journey, as you mentioned, and becoming an editor at Scientific American, and even writing for Physics Today, in that sense, do you feel that, let's say, the media offers people like you a more variety when it comes to exploring different topics? Whereas if you are part of an academic institution, be it for good or bad, your research is confined to that particular subject area. That could be good if you wanted to do serious research, but as you mentioned, it doesn't allow you to venture into different things, as you've talked about, societal things about anthropology, even with your works, with the land of naked people, in that sense. So do you think that the media offers people like you that opportunity?
Well, I don't know if it's the media, but Scientific American specifically is most of the articles are written by expert authors explaining their deep research in their fields, and we help them
Right.
explain it to the layperson. But you're absolutely right that there is, of course, a lot to be learned through immersion. At the same time, fields have gotten so specialized and so narrow and compartmentalized that people don't know how to talk to each other.
Right.
It can be very difficult for me to understand even the jargon for in a field like, say, social sciences or linguistics, or even with the help of that. What we do when we edit articles for Scientific American is we work deeply with the authors to understand what they're trying to say, and that gives you a really good introduction to a topic. But I think that's a very special place to be, and there's really no other magazine like that in the world that gets the experts to write about their own work. So I feel very privileged to be there. I've returned to that magazine after a break of almost 20 years, during which time I was living in Germany, which I still do. But yeah, I find it to be an intellectual journey that allows for real overlap of fields and just expansion in the way I think, because I have a passing acquaintance with so many different fields by now.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm just sort of going to put this subjective question towards you. Not really, I'm not really expecting a really constructed answer in that sense. But do you feel that with us being so confined into our subject streams, that, for example, if you are, let's say, so I'm studying sports science in the UK and I want to work in football long term, it almost becomes that if you are pursuing a sort of profession, people would start associating you would say that, oh, so that person is working in sports, so I probably wouldn't be best in terms to ask him about something else, or we've just sort of become, I don't know how to frame this, but for the good or bad, maybe, because society maybe is getting more specialist in that sense. But in the olden days, at least from what I remember, what my father used to say to me says to me is that there used to be a lot more people, because even I grew up in Calcutta, who had an opinion. Sorry. So I was saying that because I even grew up in Calcutta and I was born and brought up there. And what I really found fascinating there was that people there had an opinion on almost everything, which I feel that is sort of being lost in the day and age today in some extent. Do you see that, or am I being short-sighted here?
Well, I should say there's a lot of value in expert opinion. And yeah, it's true that, I wouldn't ask, if I need an opinion, I would ask someone who I think is informed about that topic. And it can take a lot of time to find the person who's informed about that topic. But that said, I sort of agree with you that people should be able to make up their own minds. It should, of course, be an informed opinion. And we are too compartmentalized nowadays, partly because of social media in terms of what we see. And But at the same time, there's a lot of opinions that, I just don't have time to go into them into a lot of depth, or to spend time with someone who I disagree with, maybe on Facebook, and I don't have time to argue with everybody or to exchange opinions with. I will ask somebody an opinion if I feel that they've said something interesting or intriguing or something that I don't know anything about. But I do think expert opinion has value.
Right. So, ma'am, you touched upon growing up in Bengal, and you said that the reason you wanted to pursue physics and become a physicist in that sense, or you at least aspired to, was because you were a child who was into reading a lot and you did a lot of deep reading. So, who were your inspirations growing up? Were there some people you looked up to, some people you read more often than others? Who were your inspirations, be it in physics, be it in philosophy, be it in any field as such?
I have no knowledge of philosophy. In terms of physics, as a teenager, I was very influenced by Feynman's lectures.
Right.
This is the famous physicist who wrote very beautifully. Although as a person, I don't think he was that great. So my father was very encouraging. He always answered my questions. And since he was an engineer, he knew a lot about how the nature works. So that was very helpful. So I pretty much had a rough idea of how I was very intuitively good at physics.
Right.
And it was for me very sad that I didn't become a physicist, although now I no longer regret it, because I do feel that I've learned so much that I wouldn't have if I was, stuck in a professorship somewhere doing this. Yeah, maybe I would do great research, maybe not, who knows. But I like who I have become.
So you touched upon Feynman there, and just if we have to explore this tangent a bit, I know we're probably going off topic in that sense, but he's someone I've really looked into as well. So from what I hear about Feynman, and you're probably a better person to comment here, is that the way he talked about physics, the way he lectured physics was so different. I don't know if you've heard about this. I think this is talked about as the Feynman effect. So when you're actually attending or listening to a lecture of his, you can sort of really grasp a lot of things because of his pedagogical approach to teaching. But when you actually leave the lecture hall and actually think about the processes he was trying to put forward, it may not be as easily put as before. Do you know
Well,
about this aspect?
I never heard of the Feynman effect, but I do know the lectures. And he provides a very deep, intuitive view of a lot of things, including optics, there's a standard way of teaching optics, and his view is very, very intuitive and beautiful, I think. But it doesn't go into the mathematics of it. And if you want to be a physicist, if you really want to understand it in depth, you really need to know the mathematics. You need to work things through for yourself. The intuition isn't enough. You need to master both. So that way, he's may not have been the greatest teacher, but his vision was beautiful.
So coming back to your first book, then I guess it's titled "The Land of Naked People" in that sense, and we touched upon you having a PhD in physics. But what were these societal things that really influenced you in writing about these people in the Andamans? That understanding their journey and understanding how they've been living, and even as you put it rightfully, and I think in other interviews as well, that some people may call them savages, but then who is to say that our way of viewing the world is the right way, and maybe their way may be the optimal way because of the way they've been living and how long they've been living as a civilization.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, the Andamanese seem to have been living on these islands for 40,000 years, 50,000, possibly longer. No one seems to really know, but they evolved a way of life that was completely within their needs were completely within the boundaries of what the islands could provide. And our needs aren't. Our civilization is expansive because we need, at any given time, we're kind of always drawing upon nature's savings, whether it's in terms of its capacity to recycle carbon, whether it's in terms of water or whatever, fresh water. So what happened was that our civilization, originally the British, ended up there in 1858, I believe, first, but there were earlier visits and earlier colonies, but the British were looking for a penal colony to put prisoners from the First War of Independence. And that's where the devastation starts. So these people have been living on these islands, fine, doing fine for what, as I said, tens of thousands of years. And within the span of a century, the population's reduced by something like 90% by the diseases that the British brought in. They included syphilis, women, the Andamanese women were raped, all kinds of other things. And just realizing how devastating the impact of our culture, which we tend to be inordinately proud of, on these people, on their ways of life and on their identities, how they're surviving to this day, the depression among the Onge, who, so much of their island has been, it was literally burned down to make room for refugees from the partition struggle and other settlers later. So our impact has been devastating to them. And these were things I had no inkling of when I started researching these things.
So, ma'am, when we talk about these things, there's this fascinating book that comes to my mind. So it's called *Sapiens*. It's by Yuval Noah Harari, and he's a great historian. And he's looked at, in the way in his work, he's talked about that there is inevitably this time that, and he calls them, let's say, humanoids in that sense. So if we call ourselves Homo sapiens, there may be other humanoids who may not be as evolved as us, but you could call them indigenous people, you could call them other, who we may call uncivilized people, who were living in let's say, tribes and other communities around the world. But as you said, with the way we started looking at the world, anyone who was even sort of different to the way the both of us are talking, or the both of us sort of view the world, we would associate them to be almost alien or almost animals in that sense. And we would start to, let's say, I don't know, constitutionalize them or liberalize them in that sense, or try to put them in structures so that it becomes easier for us. Am I making any sense there, or do you see a sort of construct like this in the world?
Well, I wouldn't say that they're less developed, in the sense that they are very highly developed in having formed a way of life that is I know it sounds very romantic to say that is in harmony with their surroundings, but they're certainly in ecological harmony with their surroundings. There's no question about that. They were. And do we compartmentalize and create and when we come across the people we want to subjugate? Of course. That I think is kind of acknowledged as the source of racism. We always see, if they have power, if someone has power over us, we see them as inherently superior. If we have power over somebody else, we see them as inferior. And that's some kind of a trick of psychology, that something we tell ourselves to justify the horrible things we do to them.
Yeah. So when you talk about that, we can't really say if they are more developed or we are more developed than them. Do you feel that and you may say that they're more ecologically in tune with the surroundings, but we could, on the other hand, say that maybe we are making more technological progress to say that there are fewer people dying at younger ages because of the advancements in medical science, etc., etc. But do you feel that there is one, I don't know, this is probably a philosophical question in that sense, but do you feel that there is one way of living life, that there is one way that we should be in terms of, I don't know, maybe maximally using resources or maximally living to our fullest potential in that sense?
Well, I think our civilization is basically destroying the biosphere on which all life is based.
Right.
So I don't see us as doing a great job. And I think we could learn a lot from people who have more egalitarian societies, who can live on less than we use. And yes, it looks like medical science has done wonders for our lifespans, but at the same time, you have to also see the history of colonialism in, for example, in India during the Victorian era. Tens of millions of people died in famines. That's the baseline you're starting with when you say that, technology has done wonders. Those famines, those deaths, that terrible lifespan, I think in the early 1920s, the average lifespan in India was 1925. And the coming out of that wasn't just the product of medical technology, it was the product of freedom. It's just ridiculous to say that, that in the 20th century we have much longer lifespans because of technology. No, we have longer lifespans because to a significant extent, colonialism vanished, although it hasn't completely vanished. And then we've also found these kind of quick fixes like vaccines to improve lifespans, whereas people are probably not healthier than they used to be. So these are very, very complex questions, and I don't feel that I can really get into them within, the space of whatever few minutes we have. Also, I should say some of these questions I'm trying to address in my third book, which is a deep critique of development.
All right, okay. So, ma'am, I don't know, I think we fall into this dichotomy here in the sense that I totally agree with the points you're making, and I see that freedom does play a massive role in that. But on the same in the same place, we can talk about how, if we look at, let's say, medieval Europe, when we look at Rome and those kind of places as well, we had basically aspects such as feces on streets because people didn't have proper sewage systems or things to uh, uh, to facilitate how to work things around in society. So I feel.
I'll tell you something. The Indus Valley civilization had sewage systems. What happened? What I'm trying to say is that progress is not necessarily linear. Yes, we're doing better than the medieval times, but you have to kind of look deeper to look at the rise and fall of different civilizations. And yeah, I'm not quite sure what you're trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that, yes, of course, and what actually made the difference to lifespans has been not so much medical technology, but sanitation. Exactly. Cleaning up the cities in Europe and putting in modern plumbing and modern sewage. But a lot of this was able to happen in Europe because of the colonies. It was because of the loot from India that the United Kingdom was able to develop, that the plumbing systems in Manchester and so on were changed. That's where the prosperity of the West comes from looting. And that it's all a one-way street of, progress and sunshine as time goes on. I would completely disagree with that. It's a very complex picture in which some parts of the world were devastated in order to benefit other parts of the world.
Right. Ma'am, I understand that there was this aspect of looting, and we should always be aware of that. But do you feel that it becomes, I don't know, we would keep ourselves in a bubble if we would keep saying that, oh, the Mughals took from us, the British took from us, and henceforth we are deprived in that sense. We understand that fact, but shouldn't we say that, yes, but what can we do now to work things out, maybe? Because we
Well,
can look at Africa currently, and the rates, I think, what's it called? The average age of people there is similar to what it was in 1950s in the UK and in Europe in that sense. So it's not like we aren't making progress, I feel. But I, in my opinion, I think it's all right if we disagree here, that if we shouldn't keep ourselves in a bubble to say that just because we are victimized, we cannot strive for progress in that sense.
yeah, I completely agree that we shouldn't be thinking of ourselves
Yeah,
as victims, and that's a problem in itself. What I
yeah,
see, for example, happening in India
right,
is this kind of constant sense that we have to catch up with the West,
yeah,
whereas maybe the way to do it in India is different. And I wouldn't say the Mughals took from us. The Mughals, it was the British who took from us. And what's happened in India, so let me try to give you a picture of Indian development.
yes, ma'am.
What happened is that after the colonies, after the World War II was over, it was clear to the Western world that the colonies could not be kept any longer. As an alternative, this paradigm of development was put in. Why? Because the West had become completely dependent on the resources and the markets in the worlds that were poor. And those used to be maintained by coercion, by colonialism. But once you've lost the colonies, what can replace it? And what began to replace it was the aspiration of elites that had been created in countries like India to become more like the West. So these Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and later the WTO, these were set up in order to export a certain way of life to these countries so that they would start needing the cars, the refrigerators, everything that the West needed. So this entire picture of, there's only one way to progress, that came about as a kind of ideology imposed on the rest of the world by the World Bank and the IMF and its very powerful backers, who are mainly the US and to a lesser extent Europe. So I have a very different view of what progress constitutes. And what I think is that the ex-colonies were persuaded to all try to quote unquote catch up with the US. And that's been kind of they weren't allowed to pursue their own ways of what we could call real development.
Right.
Instead, we always had to run after them. And the only country that's actually caught up was China, which didn't submit to the World Bank prescriptions. Anyway, this is a very long story, and I don't know where to begin and where to end. So maybe you should move on to your next question.
It's fascinating though. But are you talking about the China of modern day under, let's say, an authoritarian regime, if they
Yeah,
haven't
so why
prescribed
is
to?
China able to feed its people? And why are so many people in India starving? I would say it has a lot to do with the fact that the Chinese made their own decisions, whereas in India, India was doing much, much better in terms of grain production, feeding its people, public, rationing system until 1991, when you start having these structural adjustment reforms imposed by the World Bank and the IMF. And that's where you start, like, in lieu of loans, India was required to reduce supports in public health, in agriculture, in virtually even the rationing system was changed. And the result has been that per capita calorie consumption in India has been going down. And this is really shocking, but that's the truth. Since the 1990s, per capita calorie consumption in India has been going down. So India, because it came under, I would say, the World Bank boot, is now heavily indebted. That original loan was supposed to meet a debt, and now I think India pays a staggering fraction of its foreign exchange in terms of debt to repayment. So anyway, where did I begin and where did I end? What I'm trying to say is that China was able to feed its people because it pursued independent policies. India did not. India lost its economic freedom.
Ma'am, when we talk about, let's say, China pursuing independent policies in that sense, I mean, I'm not really the biggest fan of the Chinese party in that sense and the way they run things there.
Oh
In
yeah,
one,
of
in one,
course. Look, I'm not. Of course, they're a repressive,
right,
brutal government. I'm not. I'm just talking about this one aspect. I'm not talking
right.
about what they do to the Uyghurs. That's just horrible. So no, I'm not a fan, and of course not. And
But
I
ma'am,
think
is
they're a
that
very
is
dangerous power right now.
yeah, for sure. But is there um, a way we can strive for development? I mean, or progress, as you were saying, and you said that you have a sort of different definition to that, in the sense that if we want, in essence, to pull off policies on a nation large front like China are doing, yet have that essence of freedom of speech or the right for individuals to express what they actually feel and not have a streamlined chain of thought that is coming straight from the government, and anyone who doesn't prescribe to the government is basically not allowed to speak in that sense.
Exactly. Yeah. What India is facing is just
It's
a
it's it's it's
monstrous,
same, yeah.
monstrous. There's no.
Yeah.
It's just terrifying. And what is surprising to me is that what the economy is contracted by a quarter within a
Hmm.
few months.
Yes.
The suffering must be so incredible, and yet all of these amazing movements by Muslim women against this CAA, and these have been completely crushed. You have some of
Yes.
the best, bravest, most self-sacrificing people like Sudha Bhardwaj in prison
Hmm.
indefinitely. This is a monstrous regime, and you have this mad king in his palace feeding
Hmm.
peacocks. Uh, um, how to get out of that? I think I don't see a simple way out. It's going to have to be a massive nonviolent revolution, and there's nobody on the streets to lead it. I know
True.
that, I mean, farmers have been committing suicide for like the last few decades. There's a
Hmm.
lot of unrest, but somehow it's not coming together, and I don't know why it's not coming together. The Congress has completely abdicated its position as opposition. I don't know what has been done to it, but there is no opposition. This is a
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
dictatorship. Um,
Ma'am, do you feel that the reason? Sorry, but it's really interesting to get into this conversation because I feel that more of these conversations should be had in the general public so that the word can get out. It's the fact that, as you're mentioning, there isn't, even if there's an opposition to the party that's in power, the BJP, that they aren't given a platform to talk about it in that sense. So
so
with the recent deal that the recent deal that BJP has signed with Facebook, I mean, who is to say that whatever they want us to see is the only information that the both of us are getting about our country in that sense?
I think you're very right that that is a very, very scary prospect.
Yes.
And Facebook and Ambani coming together. Uh, of course, Ambani is the uncrowned emperor of India. Um, but that is just a terrifying prospect because Ambani, with his monopoly over, well, Geo and all of that, and
Hmm.
the way the BJP government went after and destroyed all of its rivals like BSNL,
Hmm.
the way the railways are being sold out, what you're seeing is just looting on this unimaginable scale. And the whole country is preoccupied with lynching some actress because her boyfriend
Yeah.
committed
Yeah.
suicide. This is a nation gone completely insane. Um, And I don't
There
know
is,
what it will take to restore sanity.
yeah, I totally agree with that. And even, I mean, it's so difficult because that's what I find really, I don't know. I mean, as you mentioned, it's such a scary prospect in that sense. And the question I'd like to pose is that do you feel this is where world politics, where world economics is moving? Because if we see the rise of Brazil, if we see the rise of Erdogan and Turkey, if we see the Chinese government, if you see India in that sense as well, they are very similar in the ways they want to portray an ideology towards their country and almost have it, uh, I don't know, a homogeneous idea of India. And yeah, and the policies that have been taken forward, like the UAPA and several others on that front, are just reflective of that. So do you see this as, I don't know, as something that's there not only in India but several other countries are adopting it around the world?
Yes, there's definitely a global trend
Hmm.
towards fascism, and there's also a global trend towards just incredible levels of inequality.
Hmm.
Um, that's very, very dangerous because you have like uh, what Ambani's now the fourth richest man in the world. He owns his wealth is
Yeah.
as much as the wealth of one third of the. I think it's a third of Indians at the bottom.
Yeah, it's
One
insane.
single man. It's unimaginable, and that kind of concentrated power and impunity. Uh, I really don't. That's. I don't think there's ever been a regime like that in
Yeah.
the entire history of human civilization. Has there ever been such incredible levels of inequality?
Hmm.
I really don't know. And it's got to topple. It will. You already see in the US very encouraging signs of just massive street protests.
Yeah.
The US, at least a lot of its institutions are still intact. Um, like the courts are
Hmm.
still reasonably fair. In India, everything's been demolished. There's
Yeah.
nothing. And yeah, it's got to give. It has to break. I don't know what it will take to break it, but this is too fragile a system to last.
Ma'am, I think you said it right there. With the aspect of such big inequalities we see around the country, and so I do believe in competence hierarchies, and I feel that's the way we have to progress as society.
I
But
don't.
what?
I
Oh,
don't.
okay,
I
right,
certainly don't. No. I
right.
think
But
you need
if I have to,
equality if you to
right,
have.
right.
I don't believe in meritocracies. I do
Okay.
believe. I think the one thing that India desperately needs is land reform.
Right.
People need to have communities need to feel secure that the land on which they are living, that they are cultivating, is not going to be taken from them. These things, it's been all been like land is being seized massively by, for example, Adani for his
Hmm.
coal mines and everything. And the environmental impact assessment is just going to make things so much worse. I don't quite understand how they can get away with so much.
Hmm. It's probably because, yeah, I think as we were talking about, like, if there's anyone who'd want to speak out in terms of an opposition, there just isn't that opportunity there in that sense. Like the reason why Arnab Goswami can and speaks so loudly and so fluently about the topics he is often talking about is because we understand that there's this agenda that's portrayed. And if there was an opposition, let's say, spokesperson in that sense, he or she probably wouldn't be given the same stance as probably someone like Arnab
Well,
has.
one problem, and the journalist Sainath has pointed to this repeatedly, is that most of the TV channels are owned by billionaires close to the BJP. Ambani alone
Yeah, yeah,
owns a massive number of TV channels. All of the major media have
yeah.
been have been brought have been brought to kneel in front of the BJP. Like Hindustan Times's former editor was
Hmm.
fired, apparently by Modi's behest. So now that's kind of a spokesperson for the BJP. You have this kind of like control exerted, and you're right, it's becoming so scary that even Facebook now is tied up with the Ambanis. And can you imagine the amount of information they have on you and me, everybody?
For sure.
With Geo and Aadhaar and now Facebook all coming together and interlocking.
Yeah.
This is totalitarianism of a kind that was beyond Orwell's conception.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think we have to look to China for examples of totalitarianism. We are getting there.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with that in that sense. Ma'am, so what was I going to talk about here? Yeah, so with this aspect of, I'm not sure if you know about this, but so I upload most of the stuff I do on YouTube and even other podcast streaming sites as well. But so YouTube have come out and said that no medical professional or any doctor can put out any advice guidance about, let's say, the pandemic if it's not in tune with the WHO guidelines. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to point out that someone would say that the historical work that WHO have done have been great, but who is to say that they should only be the only source that we should look towards when it comes towards
agree with you.
something?
I completely agree with you. I don't believe in like censorship of this kind.
True. And that's what's happening. I mean, so you were talking about the whole Facebook BJP deal. Like that's what they said. They've so maybe we disagree here, but they've talked about this aspect of hate speech and how hate speech cannot be tolerated in many aspects of, let's say, Facebook. And who's to say that the BJP won't use that in someone posing opposing comments towards their government?
You have seen this the expose, right?
Yeah.
About how Facebook's fake news and hate speech was not removed by BJP's hate speech and its entire propaganda machine and its IT fake news factories. Those were given free rein on Facebook, whereas they removed fake news from any opposition. I mean, that's already happening, and now we know about it. It's also been clear for a long time that Kashmiris and Palestinians, a lot of their posts are blocked or banned.
Shadow banned, yeah.
Yeah. And of course, Kashmir has been through this internet shutdown and slowdown for a year now. And I don't know, it's somehow monstrosity has become the norm in India. And this is not the India that I imagined when I was a child.
What do you think is a way that, let's say, the current regime would topple them? What would it take for them to do in a country that's so large? Would it be, I mean, for them to announce that it's a fully Hindu country if they haven't already, or like what would they have to do to really spark that sort of revolt in terms of in people's eyes? Because when they came out with the Arigya Setu app, who is to say that's not something to revolt about? Because I had really strong opinions about why I'm not going to install that. And if someone, when I'm walking into a mall, if a security guard's asking me about that, I'm not simply going to give that up just because the government wants me to. And that's the way they want to see things.
I don't know, I don't have the answer to that because I mean, I don't know. Like when this lockdown was declared, all those migrants, instead of walking home, why didn't they get together and attack the palaces? I don't understand what it would take. But I do think the system is extremely fragile at the moment. Because you can't have like the economy is contracted.
Go on. Sorry. Yeah.
And that, and in the face of it, instead of actually trying to help the people, you have the railways being sold, people being reduced from permanent state employees into contract workers. the most
Mm.
regressive labor laws coming in, the most regressive, outrageous environmental laws coming in. What will it take until people are
Yeah.
angry enough? I think people are angry. It's just that I don't think they know what to do. And that's
Yeah.
where I think the problem with like the complete control of the airwaves comes in. There's no way for people to really get together and think about these things and discuss what they should do to protect themselves.
Yeah. So I think this happened in the last elections as well because unemployment was at its highest. The economy was doing poor, poorer than I don't know how long. But they simply talked about the Pulwama case and showed this aspect of uh, how they're actually striving towards doing something for the country and just portray this idea of India in that sense. And that really won them the election. So who is to say that they won't do it once again in the next term and keep on doing it? Because it's not only in India. We've seen several other cases around the world that governments have actually used this aspect of nationalism to as a vote bank, really.
So that whole Pulwama thing, right? There's this very
Hmm.
curious fact of the same guy popping up everywhere. What was his name? The one who was arrested with terrorists in Kashmir. And then it turns out he also happened to be posted in Pulwama. And he also turns to have very close connections with Ajit Doval. And
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it sounds like a conspiracy theory, but my God, can you really, I, nobody would put it past them, right?
Yeah.
Um, so all of these links, and I think what's actually is encouraging is that you do have these things being reported, even if it is within some small circles and they're not being seen by the majority of people, but they're still being reported. Now, whether Facebook is going to clamp down on that, quite possibly.
Mm.
It's going to be sort of, yeah, become invisible. It'll be so far down your news feed that you don't ever get to see it.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I mean, ma'am. So not to become a conspiracy theorist, but I have this. I don't know. Probably you may have more thoughts around this. So there was this investigative journalist. I'm forgetting his name now. So he did this brilliant research into so the UC browser and a couple of other Chinese apps that have currently gone banned in India. There was this documentation between the BJP and the Chinese party who had already had these talks in 2014, saying that aspects like saying that if you allow and propagate these applications in your country, like UC browser and the other applications that were used in India, we would provide you access to the users who are using these applications, which you can in tune use as aspects to increase your vote bank or increase, let's say, aspects that you don't know about uh, your
That's
population.
very interesting. I haven't heard this. And you don't
So,
remember who did it?
but I would definitely no, it's his name's slipping out. So someone else mentioned this in a previous podcast conversation, but I will link it back and I'll send you the details. But it's really interesting to see how everything that's happening, it's already been done, and the BJP have already worked these things out. I mean, it's not a coincidence, is it, that one day when the PUBG application, which is the most played game in India and South Asia, goes banned, the next day there is something called 4G, which is, let's say, a Reliance-based application that gets released by Akshay Kumar and a couple of other people right the next day. So
Yeah, I mean, of course, the day after demonetization, there were these ads in the papers for PayPal, what is it, the Geo payment portal, whatever that's called,
mm.
right the day after.
Yeah.
They all knew. In fact, I've been told that a lot of, yeah, they basically knew ahead of time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
So
whole thing was another scam.
yeah. This has been really interesting talking about our current government. I think we need more conversations like this. But I would like to tie this back to your second book, which was Churchill's Secret War, and I find Churchill as a really fascinating character, just because of the way people view him. Because if you talk to people in India, they would see him as a total monster in that sense. But if you talk to people in some pockets of the UK who aren't as aware about, let's say, the Bengal famine, they would still consider him a hero because he stood up against Adolf Hitler and aspects like that. So, I want to talk to you about your book and what was your inspiration really for writing a book about Churchill and the Bengal famine. I know you grew up in Bengal, and I think in a previous conversation you've talked about some of the experiences your mother's even had with the Bengal famine. So just walk me through that journey.
Well, that happens soon after I wrote the Andaman book. I felt I had a sense of how the world treated Aboriginal peoples, but I had no idea about just ordinary poverty. And I grew up middle class in Calcutta, and we always had servants. And I never understood how it was that they had so little. Some of them wouldn't even have a change of clothes. They'd come and we'd have to give them clothes to wear. And I wanted to understand the source of that poverty. But of course, these are like very complicated questions in economics. And I, being a physicist, thought, let me simplify the problem and study a famine. So that's poverty in just one dimension of food. And maybe if I understand that one, I will have a sense of where it all comes from. So I had heard about the Bengal famine from a neighbor. Interestingly enough, my parents never told me about it. And, we can go into why that whole memory was suppressed by the middle class, at least. And I started reading about it. It took me like a couple of years to just read up the background of, just understand how British colonial economics worked, because it was all quote unquote free market, but there was just so much coercion underlying that free market. It was all hidden, and that's why I think it's very, those of us who come from the sciences, we think, oh, we really understand how the world works, but we don't. You have to really study it very deeply to figure out what the difference between what things look like and what they actually are like. So anyway, it took me at least 2 or 3 years to simply understand British colonial economics and read up about famines, and eventually I had questions in my mind about the Bengal famine, which was already at the time a very well-studied famine. As famines go, I didn't actually imagine I would find anything new about it. But I had questions that I put to experts. So like, why wasn't any relief sent? And the standard answer was that there weren't any ships. And the experts, basically the 2 people who bothered to reply, most of them didn't, basically told me I was barking up the wrong tree, that I should look elsewhere, that the full explanation for the Bengal famine could be found within India's borders. But I didn't stop looking. I ended up at the archives in Kew in England, where I looked up the archives of the British merchant shipping, because I wanted to know what was actually going on with those ships. And that's where I found a trove of documents on the Bengal famine, and had already started to suspect that Churchill had something to do with it. But those documents and other ancillary reading I had been doing in other archives pretty much put the blame for the famine on the War Cabinet in London. And this was a connection that had been deliberately blocked by the Famine Commission inquiry. So there was an inquiry into the famine which happened during World War II, and the terms of what the commission would look at, that was determined in London, and Amory, the Secretary of State for India, took care that any links that led back to London would not be explored. So the inquiry commission was not allowed to interview anybody who actually knew what had happened, like Wavell or Linlithgow. They did talk to Pinnell, who was Linlithgow's representative to Bengal, who was in charge of the scorched earth policy. But I don't think there was any mention of the role of the war cabinet, except in the Nanavati papers. The Nanavati papers are a very interesting resource. In Delhi, that the National Archives in Delhi, invaluable resource about World War II. And these are the secret transcripts of the Famine Commission. So the Famine Commission's actual transcripts, they had interviewed a lot of people who pointed to indirectly to London, Churchill insisting on exports of rice from Bengal, even though there's a famine. All of these transcripts were supposed to have been destroyed, but one Indian member kept his copy, and that was Justice Nanavati. And thank heavens he did, because that's how we get a lot of insights. So I followed all of these archives and looked at them in a lot of depth, which no historian had done. And that's where I pieced together this picture that put Churchill at the center of it all. I wasn't going after Churchill.
Right.
I ended up with him.
Right. So, ma'am, there's a lot to unpick here, but just to start off, I guess, so you talked about how when you initially heard about the famine, it was through a neighbor, and your parents in that sense shielded you against it in that way. Why do you feel
think they shielded me as such? I think the Bengali middle class has a sense of guilt about the famine because they weren't affected. My mother's mother died during the famine. It was of tuberculosis. No medicines were available. But it wasn't because of starvation. And
I'm sorry, but why do you feel that it still isn't so widely talked about? Like something I generally, like since I've known about the famine, I've been shocked to see that how much art history books and even the wider media talks about Western aspects. And this can probably go back to what you were earlier pointing about this whole aspect of westernization that the world has sort of undergone. And that we know much more about what happened in the Holocaust than we did in our backyard in what happened in Bengal with the Bengali famine. Why do you feel that is? Like, is it just because of the media we consume, of the books we read?
We know about the Holocaust
much more than we do about the famine.
Yeah, I'm trying to answer your question.
Sorry.
We know the Holocaust because victors write history.
Yeah.
Germans lost the war. And they have, I think, since undergone a very deep introspection into the whole history of the Holocaust. And this is taught to every student in Germany, since I live here right now. In the UK, there never was such a reckoning. Churchill wrote his memoir of the war, which has been passed off as the history of the war. And it's only in recent years that it's become clear that it wasn't the British forces or Churchill who defeated Hitler. It was actually Stalin and his forces. No, I'm not an admirer of Stalin, but just to say that British atrocities have not been looked at. They have not been acknowledged. I would say the same is also true of American atrocities, which mostly happen in the last, century. Yes, people have written about it, but generally there is kind of a trend of not looking at these things or dismissing them as marginal views.
Yeah. So, so I think I lost my question, but it was in relation to Churchill in that sense, and this points me toward the Gulag Archipelago. Again, if you've read that book, it's so.
Yes, I have.
It's a great read and it's very well written, but it's so dark in what evil can actually be within us, and what sort of evil atrocities individuals can actually do. So it's a subjective question that I point towards you, and is that, do you feel that if the both of us were maybe born in, let's say, Nazi Germany, or were in let's say a camp uh, which was doing such atrocities around the world, do you feel that how difficult would it have been to come out of that, let's say, brainwash that these individuals do on us, on the individuals there, to commit those sort of crimes? Like, I mean, do you feel that if we were there, in Nazi Germany, we would have been able to fight up in that sense, have a moral grounding to say that no, I wouldn't do that, or we would just be consumed in the way the ideology that's being presented all around us?
I think that's really depends a lot on the individual, but it's definitely very hard to go against the consensus. And I'm a little afraid that what we're seeing in India today resembles Nazi Germany.
Exactly, yeah.
There is a history by someone called Sebastian Hafner, who was German. He's a German-born historian, ended up in England, and he writes about what happened to his group of friends in the 1930s. There used to be a group of, I guess, male friends. They would meet to just chat and drink or whatever, play some games. And over the years, as you know, the Nazi ideology started to rise, this group kind of split up into people who would almost end up like killing each other. So he had this Sebastian Hafner had a Jewish friend and a Jewish girlfriend who I think they both left. He eventually left. Another friend of his was, I forget what it was, but two of the group became Nazis. And you could see the split, the contentious, and the idea that people who had been friends would actually kill each other, or at least, rather, two of them would kill the rest. That didn't actually happen, but I've also seen in India, like, people fall apart. Families kind of become very. I have friends who cannot talk to their parents or their relatives who are so brainwashed.
Yeah.
And on Facebook, I don't know how many hundreds of people I've had to block because, started out by, trying to explain, and then I realized that there is no way you can explain.
Yeah.
There is no way you can have a conversation with someone who doesn't want to have a conversation.
That's the whole thing I was talking to you about, ma'am, with the example I gave with the Gulag Archipelago, in the sense that if there is this overarching ideology that's so over-consuming in that sense, it's almost an indoctrination. Like if we see what as you mentioned with religious activities as well, like some religions around the world, if you take the example of Islam, where kids are indoctrinated into religion at a very, very young age. So and that sort of becomes their worldview as they grow up, and then to take them out of that scenario and then talk to them about different aspects of life, it almost becomes so difficult. So I understand that you talk about that it is very difficult to come out of that ideology, but it's still our decision. If I'm misquoting you, do correct me there. But
no, I agree with you. It again really depends on the individual. One thing I've noticed is that a lot of the really, really brave people in India, the ones who are speaking out at the risk of imprisonment or worse, a lot of them, their parents or their heritage has something to do with the freedom struggle. So that's something I have personally observed. But what happened in the freedom struggle is that one set of people did all the sacrifices, and the other set of people just moved in and took power. And that, I think, is where the problem lies. So what happened was that the British, basically, they handed over the administration pretty much intact to Indians. And within that administration were a lot of Indians who had served the British perfectly well. And they just benefited from the transfer of power. The entire systems, like the police, even the structure of the army, which is like structured along communities so that you can have Naga battalions in Chhattisgarh, everything passed over intact. And that was the real problem. And then all you had to do was, so basically the structure of extraction of wealth and extraction, whatever the gains from the Nehru era, a lot of that has also been wiped out by the structural adjustment reforms of the 1990s. So I think what I'm trying to say is that there are two competing cultures in India. One is that of just profiting in any way you can from the status quo, and the other is that of rebellion, but the people who are rebellious are very, very few.
Yeah. Ma'am, I know we talked about this earlier. Like I generally do believe in a meritocracy, in competence hierarchies in that sense. And like the case I'm trying to make here is that we shouldn't, at least in my opinion, fall under a trap. I'm not saying this is in the case of India, but if we look at the world in a lens that we shouldn't always only criticize people, let's say, who are at the top of, let's say hierarchies, to be there just at the expense of others. I feel that there is, in my opinion at least, if that is, we can maybe disagree here, that there should always be this aspect that if someone reaches a hierarchy, it is because of competence, at least in my opinion.
Oh, I think that's very naive. I'm sorry. I completely disagree.
Right.
You can reach the top of a hierarchy just by being.
No, I'm not saying that once you are at the top of a hierarchy, it's not that you won't be, let's say, tyrannical in that sense. And that's why that's the essence of hierarchies, that they can move into tyranny. And that's when the general populace comes in, revolts to say that whatever is wrong with the, say, hierarchy.
Look, I don't believe in hierarchy. I believe in grassroots democracy.
Right.
And I think hierarchies are inherently dangerous because, for example, when you look at Churchill, the kind of power he had to determine the lives of hundreds of millions of people, nobody should have that kind of power because humans are simply not equipped to deal with such decisions in a fair and equitable way. We are fundamentally tribal in the sense that our immediate families, our immediate groups, they mean more to us than distant people. And that's why power is inherently dangerous, because you have someone with power, but with like a hierarchy of empathy. That is seriously dangerous. So no, I don't really believe in hierarchy. I believe in real grassroots democracy, where the people at the top are accountable to the people at the bottom.
Dr. Madhusree Mukerjee, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. I got to learn a lot about famine and even your take about what's happening in India. And I'm glad to hear that, because from most of the people who I have conversed with who are living abroad, some of them really look at the Modi government as doing such great works, and I feel that's very naive. And I think you are taking the right step, and I think the work you're doing is great as well. And yeah, I hope we can do this sometime in person. Just before going, if there's anything you'd like to plug, anywhere where the people can find your work, your social medias, do feel free.
Oh, not really. Thank you. There's nothing I need to plug right now. Once I finish my third book, I will reach out to you and plug it. Thank you.
For sure, ma'am. Thanks for coming on once again.
And thanks for inviting me. Take care. It's been nice talking to you.
Thank you.
It's nice talking to someone who's so, well, what is it? Full of life and interest.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I hope to meet you sometime in person, ma'am.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
If you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Madhusree Mukerjee, do consider buying her books, The Land of Naked People and Churchill's Secret War. This was a fascinating conversation I had with her. We delved into her books, and even about the Indian government, which wasn't something I was expecting to get into, but it was really nice to hear Dr. Madhusree's view on things, and aptly so. That's a similar way I look at the current government in India, and how they're running things there. So yeah, that was really interesting. If you would like to follow me and my work though, you can consider subscribing to the YouTube channel, dropping a review slash rating on Apple Podcasts. It really helps the audience grow. Or you could simply follow me on my social media handles, which are as follows: my Instagram handle at Ishan Agarwal _, my Twitter handle at Agarwal Ishan _, my website slash blog ishanagarwal.net. I would also like to thank Nandini Agarwal for the amazing thumbnail artwork. You can follow her and her work on her Instagram at Nandini Studio. It was just a fascinating conversation, as I previously mentioned, and yeah, I know Dr. Mukherjee just had a little bit of time for me today, but this is a conversation I would like to take up because there's still so much I feel that is left to be explored about Churchill. And yeah, until then, see you.